Today we have an early game for Mikhail Tal back when he was at his swashbuckling best. I think he would have been 20 or 21 when this game was played in 1957 at the USSR Championship. His opponent is a Konstantin Kleiman. I can't find any title on him, but if he was playing in the USSR Championship in 1957, you can bet he was a strong chess player. Tal has white. Clayman has black. Let us jump right in. E4, C5, knight F3, knight C6, D4, CD, knight D4, knight F6, knight C3, and now D6. So Clayman has played the classical Sicilian. One of the ideas behind the classical Sicilian is that black develops pieces a little more quickly. In a knight or for a dragon, they focus a little bit more on pawn structure and delay developing the pieces. But in a classical, they get their pieces out. So it's often a little safer for black. A bishop g5, the Rouser or Richter-Rouser line from white, which is pretty much the standard main line from white in this opening. Bishop to d7, queen to d2, now knight d4, queen to a5, pinning the knight on c3 and also hitting the bishop at g5. And Tal goes ahead and takes that knight, recapturing with the g-pawn, and we have here sort of a standard structure for black in the Rouser variation. You can see black has the two bishops, and these nice little clump of pawns. Eventually this pawn at e7 will move to e6, creating what is known as sort of a little center. It has its weaknesses, but it also has its strengths. The main weakness, of course, is that the king is in the middle of the board, and it's hard to find a place for it. It'll often stay in the middle. Black would love to trade queens here and go into an endgame. White wants to avoid that. The endgame is good for black because the pawns control key squares, and he has the bishop pair. Long castle from Tal, rook to c8, putting pressure down that file. f4, the main target for white in this structure is this e6 square. Even after black has played e6, that's where white wants to aim. Rook to g8, b3, or g3, excuse me, protecting the pawn and also allowing the bishop to develop. e6, and now bishop to h3. We can see Tal already. Black's voluntarily put his king in the middle of the board against Tal. Maybe he didn't know exactly who he was playing here. Tal is already targeting that e6 square, ready perhaps for potential sacrifice to get at the king. Queen to c5. Black says, let's get queens off, and you do not want to trade queens here. So queen to d2, b5, beginning the queenside advance, and now rook h to e1. Tal centralizes his heavy pieces. We can see these two rooks and queen aiming at the king in the middle of the board, but there's a lot of defensive possibilities for black, so it's not so easy for white to get through and get at the king. b4 kicks the knight goes to e2. This knight will reroute to d4, so along with the bishop and perhaps an f5 pawn advance, he really wants to crash in on that e6 square. The queen goes to c4, attacking the a2 pawn and the e4 pawn. The king goes to b1 to protect a2, but now Clayman makes a move that would later, I'm sure, be considered completely reckless against Mikhail Tal. He plays queen takes e4, helping to open up that file towards the king. Yes, he grabs a central pawn, but now this rook on e1 has one less object in its path towards the black king. The better move was probably a5, just continuing to advance on the queen side. But I'm glad he didn't do it because we get to see this game now. F5 is actually a modern computer idea that is very strong here. After e5, which would pretty much be forced, the knight goes to f4, and it can't be taken because of the pin, and after the queen moves, the knight goes to d5, and white has a total bind and is completely winning this position. Tal plays the knight to d4, continuing basically his path of trying to destroy on the e6 square. The queen goes back to b7, now queen to d3, aiming at h7. Just going ahead and playing rook to h8, saying, hey, I got to protect that pawn was probably the best idea. But Clayman instead says you can have the pawn. He plays the bishop to e7, and Tal takes it. This isn't just some pawn grab. That queen is aggressively posted at h7 for attack. The rook goes to f8, and now bishop to g4. The idea is that the bishop would go to h5, attacking f7, also pinning f7, making the e6 square that much more vulnerable. Queen goes to c7, attacking the c2 pawn, but at the moment, that pawn is well defended. The queen and the knight both defend c2. Tal actually plays a surprisingly passive move here. He plays the move king to a1. I'm sure later in his career he would have gone ahead and just played bishop to h5. His king really doesn't have that much to worry about. But he plays king to a1 here, and here f5 from black. Now this is like waving a red cape in front of a bull. I mean, the idea, there's no way Tal is going to resist sacrificing material to get at the king, and he does. Bishop takes f5. There's no way he could resist this move. The best move for black here is to just play queen to c4, which helps defend e6, but he goes ahead and takes the bishop, and, you know, really powerful. There are no prizes, by the way, for guessing the next move. That's right. Rook takes e7 check. King takes e7. So Tal is down a whole rook, but I'm sure he felt very confident in his ability to execute this attack. Now, there are a lot of moves here that are only moves that he has to make. If he makes another move, then his attack would fade, but he makes these attacking moves with great accuracy. First, rook to e1 check, kicking the king back. You cannot interpose the bishop, because then knight takes e6. The pawn cannot recapture the knight because it's pinned by the queen. The knight hits the rook, the queen, and threatens discovery against the king. The game would be over. So instead, the king really has to go to d8, queen to h4 check, forcing f6. It's the only thing he can play. But now the queen goes back to h6, hitting the rook at f8, forcing a decision. Now here, Kleiman realizes he can't keep the rook, that the position would collapse. So, I mean, if he plays rook to f7, check at h8, it just falls apart. So he plays the queen to a5 to give his king an escape square on c7. Says, you can take the rook, but I'll move my king away. I was already up a rook, so I'd just be even material. I mean, he was down a pawn, but otherwise even material. So if Tal were to play queen to f8 check, it would actually be a big mistake, because after king to c7, black is surprisingly equal, and white would really need to play queen to f7. If he were to take the pawn at f6, then the shocking reply b3 would have come from Kleiman, threatening mate on a2 and the rook on e1, and Tal would be completely lost in this position. So he doesn't take the rook. Instead, he plays this move, which might not look very obvious unless you saw that last variation. He plays the move knight to b3, blocking that pawn and hitting the queen. Now, when the queen moves, he can take the rook with check without having to worry about that variation that we just saw. Queen to c7 and queen to f6. Now this works. The rook goes to e8. If he trades, then he'd have to worry about the back rank threat on d1. So rook to c1. Also, he's threatening to play c3, opening up the c file, aiming at the king. The bishop goes to a4, and now queen to d4 from Tal. If he takes the knight, then pawn takes his with check, so that wouldn't win a piece. And if he were to exchange queens, this endgame is pretty easy for white. Not only is he up 2 pawns, he has a better minor piece, much healthier pawn structure. Tal, I'm sure, would win this without much problem. So instead, Kleiman plays the queen back to b7, rook to d1, aiming at the weak d6 pawn. The rook goes to e6 to defend, but then queen to c4 check. And in this position, Kleiman resigned. He cannot play king to d7 to defend the rook, because then this move would come, knight to c5 check, forking the king and queen, and the pawn cannot take the knight because it is pinned by the rook at d1. A classic Tal attack, king in the middle of the board, didn't have much chance. Thank you for joining us at Chess Talk. See you again soon.